Okay, it's time for another tutorial. This is a special edition follow-up video to one that I posted previously dealing with filler materials mixed into ArtKast resin. So in the previous video, we took some just standard ArtKast resin and then we added a substantial amount of filler. In fact, I think the maximum I did was a little bit more than double the total volume. I basically more than doubled the volume. So I started out with, say you have like 8 ounces of liquid resin and then adding maybe another 10 ounces of filler material. And for that, we used play sand. And what that gives us is a part that we accomplish a couple of things. One, we lower the cost, which of course that's always nice. But more importantly, for some of you doing miniatures and small sculptures that you want to have nice weight to them, it adds a lot of weight. So that's a nice combination of attributes. If you can lower the cost and raise the weight, that's one of those weird things. This is a conversation I had with one of you the other day on the telephone machine, was that whole idea of weight being associated with expense and value. So when people pick up a sculpture that has some heft to it, they typically associate that with something that has a greater value to it. Whereas when you pick up a lightweight piece, sometimes people think light equals cheap, which of course, as we know in the resin world, that is quite the opposite. But that's a great thing to remember when you're marketing your sculpture to the general public and you have stuff, desktop pieces and whatnot that people are going to pick up. It's really helpful for those things to have additional weight. So in this tutorial, we're going to cover the process of, we're going to cover two things. We're going to compare the weights of the unfilled and the filled pieces, because one of you commented that it didn't look like they weighed that much more. So we're going to look into that. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to take a regular piece like this. This is just a giant chess piece. I bought a set of these off of the Amazons just for some Mickey Mouse things to make molds of. And we're going to take this piece and do a slightly different variation on that. Again, this is one of the things I mentioned in the previous video, but I thought it deserved its own video. So on a larger sculpture, sometimes you might have a piece that warrants the use of filler to, again, lower the cost and to give it that additional weight. But the surface could be such that you don't want to sacrifice that by mixing in filler that could compromise that surface detail. Because again, if you go back, and I'll link at the end of this video, I'll link to that previous tutorial. But when you're sloshing that around, if you're using a filler, that filler raises viscosity, which in some cases that might be good, but in cases of really detailed surfaces, that could be really bad. They can wind up with a lot of surface air bubbles trying to slosh a really thick filled resin around inside a mold. So what we're going to do here is we're going to first slosh a layer of straight ArtKast resin, then we're going to back it up with heavily filled resin. So we get the best of both techniques. Now, the trade-off there is we have an additional labor investment. Now, we have additional steps we have to do where we have to slosh that first coat and then mix up a totally separate batch to backfill it. But again, small price to pay if the savings makes sense. So let's get started. Okay, just like the previous resin cast we did in the filler video, we're going to be using the ArtKast Pourable. This is just a general purpose, kind of plain vanilla, but you shouldn't need it, casting resin that has about a 3-minute working time and then about a 15 to 20 minute demold. And again, our silicone mold that we're using, this is just a very basic cut block mold with P525 silicone. And this, unless you're doing a lot of casting, doesn't really require mold release. And I especially don't recommend mold release if you're gonna be painting that later. Otherwise, you have to degrease your parts to remove any mold release put in there. Now, ArtKast pourable resin is mixed 1-to-1 by weight. And like I said, we just need a small batch of this just to coat the inside of this mold. And what we're going to do is we're first going to just coat the inside of the mold to get the detail with just straight resin, and then we're going to come back with heavily filled resin to fill the interior. Now normally this particular resin system, this is just going to cure kind of an ivory color, but in this instance we want kind of a gray for a little bit better contrast, so we're just going to add a little bit of the Polycolor Black. And you can add up to 1% of the total mass in Polycolor pigments. I've exceeded that before, and what starts happening, you start to see some softening in some products, but best to stay within that 1% range so that you don't start changing the physicals. Now again, all I'm trying to do here is just coat the inside of the mold. So I've just got what amounts to, let's see, just a little bit over 2 ounces of liquid resin. And one of the nice things about this formula, the viscosity is such that you can get away with rotationally casting. You'll find some of the really low viscosity resins are so low viscosity they don't really work for rotational casting because they immediately just seek the lowest point in the mold, which is great for solid cast, not so great for rotational casting. So again, we're just going to keep that moving around. It's always a good idea if you're hand rotationally casting like this, keep your mixing cup handy and so you can recycle that as you pour it in and out of the mold. This is kind of a tricky mold to slosh around on the inside because it's kind of a weird shape. And the little chin of the chest piece right here is over on this side. And I have a vent in place for solid pours, but this being a rotationally cast, that vent is not as important. And again, one of the nice things about a mold like this is it rolls easily, so easy to keep that, get that coated. I always like to turn it over, so again, we get a good coating right in here. And remember, your working time on this is 3 minutes at room temperature, 70 degrees. So if you are in a warmer environment, obviously that's going to go off faster. Colder environment, it's going to be slower, but it's really, you're always walking on thin ice when you start getting below 60 degrees. Sometimes you can wind up with casts that come out really brittle. And another thing is, what's left over here, this is starting to gel. So that's a good way to time what's happening inside your mold. Here we have a pretty good view inside and we can see when it stops flowing. But if you're working with a really intricate mold that you can't really see the inside of, really helps to keep your mixing cup handy to track the progress of whatever's happening inside your mold. Now, as this is gelling, I'm going to get the next batch ready because I don't want to wait too long before I pour to backfill this. If I wait too long, I'm not going to get a good bond between that backfill resin and that surface. Okay, now ready to pour our backfill resin. And this is again going to be filled with play sand. So I don't need a whole lot of liquid resin because we're going to add a high percentage of the play sand to lower the cost and just to give this piece a good bit of weight. Now, someone asked in the comment section of the previous video about mixing in the filler first. Now, the only downside to doing that is when you add the filler into, say, the part B first before we add our part A, that makes it really difficult to then mix the A because now we have a low viscosity A that we're mixing with a very high viscosity B with all those fillers. So can it be done? Yes, but that's going to make mixing that much more difficult. So I always like to get my A and B components mixed thoroughly because if this doesn't get stirred in thoroughly, it's not going to change the chemistry of the finished product. But if these two components don't get mixed thoroughly, we're going to have big problems later. Okay, and again, just in case, we're going to add a little bit of black pigment and get that stirred in. Now we added about 6 fluid ounces of sand to about 8 ounces of the original volume. So a substantial amount of play sand here, and I could probably add a little bit more. So we're going to be about doubling our resin volume, almost doubling the resin volume by adding sand. Delicious. Don't eat the resin. Now, because I do have that chin right here, I'm going to go ahead really quick and spin this around and make sure that face gets filled really good. And then fill it up the rest of the way. And again, because that is really hard to trim, I want to try to scrape that back down to that raw resin from that original rotational cast so that we'll have minimal cleanup work on this. And the other thing I'm going to do is go ahead and scrape out this bucket before this sets, because this will also be very difficult to clean. So this basically doubled the amount of resin. We had just right around 8 ounces of the original batch of resin, and I doubled it almost to 16 ounces with sand. So a substantial increase in volume. Now you'll see probably a slight color change when this kicks off, but you notice it's still leveled out really nice. We've got a few little air bubbles coming to the surface, but overall we have a good cast. And again, I just want to be really careful. I want to make sure I trim that edge as soon as I demold this part, because if I wait too long, because that sand in there, that will be like a rock. Okay, it's about 20 minutes later and we have a nice solid part. And again, first order of business is to do our trimming so we don't wind up with a part that is impossible to clean up later. And you see my happy little vent there. Okay, now for the moment of truth. So our original resin piece that's just a unfilled pigmented cast. This piece is 376 grams. So not lightweight, but not too terribly heavy. Now this is 600 grams on the money. So 600 grams versus 376. So we've added, by adding sand, we've displaced a fair amount of the resin and added over 200 grams, 224 grams to our weight. So I'd say that's a substantial increase, and of course that's not because we do have that slush cast, that took a little bit more volume up. But that's a nice way to make a really tough part. And I'm going to take these outside here in a second, and we're going to do some strength tests with these, since these are just for this video. We're going to put them through an accelerated wear test. Now, just to give you an idea about the cast we did in the previous video, this is the little ornamental cast we did with no filler. This is just straight ArtKast resin. This is 136 grams. Now this is the lower percentage we did, and that's 231 grams. So this added almost a full 100 grams onto that one. So you can see why that does have a little chunkier feel to it. And this is the one that has the most filler. So again, the highest score to beat is 234. So that's 134. And this is 259. So substantially heavier. So this is 231. This is 259. So there you have a substantial weight increase by adding fillers. And then again, when you're doing something like this with a part that has a nice smooth surface, that you don't want the filler to show up like this, even though this feels smooth to the touch, you can look at that and see that there is an obvious filler material. Whereas that filler is disguised by that surface coat. But again, cannot stress enough, anytime you're going to do a technique like this, it's imperative that you follow up that first slosh coat with that filler coat or that filler layer. If you wait too long, those will delaminate and you can even get little blisters in between those two layers. So real important to move fast and also be in an uncontaminated shop space where you don't have to worry about residual moisture getting down into the mold. Okay, so this is the accelerated wear test of some of these resin cast pieces, just so you can see how these behave with and without filler. So this is our unfilled part. Of course, no breakage, didn't really expect it. That's a pretty tough, impact-resistant resin. So the ArtKast just by itself takes a fair amount of abuse. But now let's go with I think this was about 40% filler. And this is a little over 50% filler. Okay, this is low filler, about 30–40%. High percentage. No filler. Little bit of filler. Lot of filler. Okay, so now you have the basic idea of using fillers with a slosh coat, so to speak. So we're combining the best of two worlds. We get the attributes of rotational casting, but then the weight of using those filler material in the core of the cast. So again, the trade-off there is mainly one of labor more than material, but there is a substantial savings, especially with really large casts, of using a filled resin to do a really large cast. So I hope that was helpful for those of you that asked about that. And I hope the accelerated wear testing was also helpful, so you can see how some of this stuff holds up to some abuse after the fact. I was actually surprised that these filled casts had the impact resistance they had. A lot of even unfilled cheap resins will just shatter like glass when they're dropped. So that was one thing that surprised me, was that loaded up with maximum filler, we still had a decent impact strength. So again, I hope that helps those of you out who were asking about fillers and adding that to some of the resin systems. Again, can't stress this enough. As we discussed in the previous video, any dry filler material needs to be completely dry, dried out, even baked in an oven at low temperature to evacuate the moisture out, because if there's any latent moisture, you'll find out really fast when it reacts with that urethane resin and turns it into a foam. And of course, as always, all of the product links will be in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And of course, the most important thing, if you're new to a lot of these resin casting techniques, be sure to check in the video description. I'll put a link to both our video library as well as specifically to the resin casting page, because we have a lot of our YouTube content organized by topic in our video library and then links to all the products. It's a really helpful place to learn if you're starting out and you're shopping for stuff and trying to figure out what does what. It's a great place to do that. And again, having all of those videos organized by topics is incredibly helpful. And last but not least, if you haven't already, we've got a lot of new things, new products that we're announcing. So if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you can go to our homepage, and there's a link right there on our homepage to sign up for that newsletter. I've been surprised just in the last couple of videos. We've had an overwhelming positive response to our newsletter. So I'll be sending one out very soon for those of you who signed up for that. And last but not least, the typical YouTube housekeeping. Make sure if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe if you haven't already, and the little bell icon so you get notified when we put up new content. And again, thanks for watching.